Please.
Thank you very much, David. That's a very generous introduction. I'm very honoured indeed to be invited to give this address on your 50th anniversary, and I'm only sorry that I'm not able to come to Aber and to be with you in person. But I am going to share my screen as I have a presentation which will, there we go. And so my talk this evening is indeed about my book, and it was published in 2020, but I thought you might like to hear a little about the reasons why I decided to write the book. And the first of those was actually re-encountering George Orwell's 1984. And I'm sure that many of you, like me, read it first when you were a teenager, and that's certainly my experience. And then I re-encountered it sort of 4 or 5 years ago, actually, as my own children as teenagers were reading it. And it really struck me, having had a career in libraries and archives, just how relevant it was to the world of knowledge and the world of information. And this quote is just one of those that really kind of leapt out of the page at me, as libraries and archives, to me, are institutions that cling to the truth. Also, of course, in recent years, we've faced the idea that there could be alternatives to the truth. So-called alternate facts, first established as a notion by Kellyanne Conway, President Trump's press secretary, in January 2017, challenging the idea, or indeed the evidence, that Obama's inauguration had received a higher attendance than Trump's. And that struck me as being a kind of chilling idea, and certainly it ought to, in my view, chill the hearts of any librarian or archivist. The real trigger, I guess, was my reading of an article in The Guardian in April 2018, which suggested, or not suggested, but gave evidence that the Home Office had destroyed a whole series of documents in their care, which they had indeed created, as landing records for the so-called Windrush generation, those of our fellow citizens who were invited to come and work in the UK after World War II, and who arrived, of course, famously on the Empire Windrush as one of the first vessels to bring them from the West Indies. And of course, in the heat of the government's immigration policy after 2010, the so-called hostile environment, those same citizens were placed under intense pressure to prove their right to remain. But the same government department that was instigating the hostile environment was also destroying the same evidence that those same individuals could have used to defend themselves. And this struck me as being indicative of the importance of the preservation of knowledge and the role that libraries and archives play for society. And I wrote an article for the Financial Times pretty much the same day as I read that original Guardian piece about the destruction of the landing cards, and that eventually turned in the book that I published last year. And one of the other triggers for that event was a collaboration which the Bodleian had established with the State Library of Berlin. And I visited them also in 2018 for a meeting. And as I was waiting for the meeting to begin, I wandered around the vicinity of the State Library's Unter den Linden building and stumbled upon the site that this photograph, the events on this photograph took place in, on Unter den Linden, what's now known as Babelplatz, a very kind of poignant cultural location near the State Opera House, near the Humboldt, what's now the Humboldt University, close to the State Library of Berlin. And here on the 10th of May 1933, an orchestrated book burning took place, orchestrated, of course, by the Nazi Party, headed and masterminded by Joseph Goebbels, where books from Jewish libraries and Jewish bookshops, and also the collection of the Institute for Sexual Sciences, established by Magnus Hirschfeld, were piled on the pyre. And this event, and of course it was filmed, the film was shown around Germany. Other locations were targeted on that night and subsequent nights around the country. And it was, of course, a warning that this cultural genocide would prefigure a human genocide. But it also triggered an opposite reaction. And that reaction took place exactly a year later, on the 10th of May 1934, when in Paris, Alfred Kantorowicz established the German Freedom Library with support from André Gide, Bertrand Russell, and Thomas Mann, where a library of about 10,000 books, most of which had been banned by the Nazi Party in Germany, was established. And similar libraries were established in New York. And indeed, after my book was published, someone wrote to me informing me that actually the Marx Memorial Library in London had been established as a response to the events in Berlin on the 10th of May 1933. And I want to come back to this idea of destruction triggering moments of kind of preservation. But my book takes a kind of long historical view on the deliberate destruction of knowledge. And one of the earliest that I look at is in the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, and in particular, this library, the library on the screen in front of you, the library of King Ashurbanipal of Assyria, the centerpiece of the British Museum's fabulous exhibition in 2018 called I Am Ashurbanipal, with this extraordinary library, a library of clay, a library of cuneiform inscriptions, and the curators of that show argue quite compellingly, I think, that it's the first library in recorded history to try to accumulate the whole of knowledge as it was understood at the time. But and there are about 30,000 tablets which survive down to us. And from scholars who've been unearthing these inscriptions, have identified in them that many of the tablets were actually seized by Ashurbanipal through his agents from the libraries and archives of his enemies. And so this idea, and one of the ideas I put, that the destruction of knowledge is not just the physical erasure, but it's also the removal of knowledge from one community by theft or sequestration. And this is an example of that, because accession records for Ashurbanipal's library show him sending his agents into neighboring Babylonia and targeting libraries and archives for the knowledge which they had. And much of that knowledge that was targeted is about the prediction of the future, and in particular divination, astrology, astronomy. And I'd like you to hold on to that thought, that libraries and archives have always held the ability to predict the future, or to help you predict the future. In ancient Mesopotamia, this was about when to plant a crop, or when to go to war, or when to father a child. But we'll revisit this concept at the end of my talk. And here you can see the site of ancient Nineveh, where Ashurbanipal's library was kept, just outside the modern-day city of Mosul in Iraq, and the great mound of Kuyunyik, which was the scene of excavations undertaken by this gentleman, Austin Henry Layard, who unearthed the most extraordinary of the finds, following actually in the footsteps of French archaeologists, but it was Layard who unearthed the most spectacular finds and brought them back to London, where they are still in the British Museum, including 20,000 tablets from Ashurbanipal's library. I'd like us to move on to perhaps the most famous library of antiquity, the Great Library of Alexandria. And I'm sharing the screen with you an image of a book written in the Great Library of Alexandria by one of its scholars, Euclid, the geometer, whose Elements of Geometry is regarded as, the founding text of modern mathematics. And we're fortunate in the Bodleian to hold the oldest surviving copy of Euclid's Elements, written in the 9th century in Byzantium. But of course, the Library of Alexandria is famous for being destroyed, for having gone up in a great fire, or so history tells us. And here's a kind of 19th century depiction of that terrible act. And I remember as a teenager watching Carl Sagan's TV program Cosmos, the first episode of which has this, tremendous description of the loss of Alexandria. And Carl Sagan says that if he could travel back in time to any location in the world at any point in time, he would go back to the Great Library of Alexandria before the fire, because there was so much knowledge that was in the library that didn't survive. But of course, the ancient writers all agree that there was a great library in Alexandria in the formed in the centuries before the Christian era, in the 4th century BC, but by the 3rd or 4th century of the Christian era, that library had gone. And that's pretty much all the ancient writers actually agree on. And they come up with different figures for the size of the library. It's either 200,000 volumes, or it's 700,000 volumes, or 500,000 volumes. So they all agree that it was a big library, but none of them agree on the time of its destruction or the reasons for it. Some of them claim that it was in the civil war between Ptolemy and Caesar, but then other writers, describe going and using the library. Strabo, for example, after those events. Other writers blame the Muslim conquerors of Alexandria, the Caliph Omar. And I think modern scholarship of that period all agrees that actually there was no single cataclysmic event that saw the library destroyed. It was rather a long, protracted period of neglect and decline in status. And of course, the library had been founded by the Ptolemaic dynasty as a great kind of state symbol of power and prestige. They poured great wealth into the institution. They attracted world famous scholars to be the librarian and to come and work in the library. They built, in fact, not one but 2 libraries, one of which, the Museion, had a community of scholars surrounding the library to work on the texts and to copy them and to develop new knowledge from their holdings. And another sister library was essentially an extension. But by the what we now call late antiquity, the library had gone, and that destruction is actually a kind of slow motion event. And again, this idea of neglect and decay over a long period of time is one which I'd like you to kind of remember, and we'll come back to it later in my talk. I'd like us to fast forward now to the Reformation, the European Reformation of the 16th century, and to my own city and my own university, to Oxford, where last year we celebrated the 700th anniversary of the Central University Library of Oxford, what we now call the Bodleian Library. But in 1320, in the University Church that you see on your screen, Thomas Cobham, the Bishop of Worcester, gave funds to establish a library, to build a new building adjacent to the church, which is in fact still exists, and he gave books, and he also gave funds to employ a chaplain to serve as librarian. And we have a handful of books from that medieval collection, like this one, given to us in the 15th century by Gilbert Keimer, the Dean of Salisbury. And then in the early 15th century, the library outgrew its room in the university church and had to move to a purpose-built library building, which is still there. It's still used as part of the Bodleian Library. It's known today as Duke Humphrey's Library because of a spectacular gift of books by Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, the brother of Henry V, and arguably one of the most powerful laymen in the country. And why he gave 400 books to the University of Oxford, not being an alum, we do not know, but the university authorities were so struck by the magnificence of this gift that they built this room to house it. But by the middle of the 1550s, the library had been ransacked. The books were gone, torn up, the pages sold to pie makers to line pie dishes and butter makers to wrap butter in. And John Bale said that in Oxford at the time, books were dog cheap and whole libraries could be had for an inconsiderable nothing. I'd like to bring into play this figure, John Leland, one of the early antiquaries, a man who was educated at Oxford and Cambridge, and then by some of the leading humanists in the University of Paris. And Leland was charged by Henry VIII with surveying the libraries in England in the middle of the 1530s in order to find evidence to support Henry's attempt to divorce himself from Catherine of Aragon and marry the beautiful courtier Anne Boleyn, and then later to divorce the church in England from papal authority to establish himself as the head of the church. And Leland made these extraordinary trips around the country known as Leland's itineraries, and his archive, again fortuitously, is in the Bodleian. And here's one of these extraordinary maps where he shows, you can see the Humber estuary and a number of the monastic sites which he visited their libraries. And this, of course, is 20 years before the first printed maps of England. So quite interesting, I think. We move to the west of England, to the site of one of the most spectacular monastic institutions from the late Middle Ages, Glastonbury Abbey. And I'm standing more or less where the monastic library would have been in the cloister, off the cloisters of Glastonbury. And Leland, in his archive, leaves us a list of books which he consulted when he came to visit the library, but he also leaves us with an account of how he felt when he actually entered the library. The library was famous. He was very, very much looking forward to visiting it. And when he crossed the threshold, he wrote, he was stupefied by the mere sight of the ancient books. So he swoons. He's really a man after my own heart. He swoons at the sight of these great books, and he writes a list of the ones that he consulted that he was most interested in. And I'd like to draw your attention to the bottom entry, Grammatica Euticis Liber Olim Sancti Dunstani. And in fact, this is that same book that Leland consulted in 1533 that is now in the Bodleian's collection, but was for centuries in the monastic library of Glastonbury Abbey. And it was indeed formed by, or at least 3 of the 4 component parts of this volume were formed by St Dunstan, sometime Abbot of Glastonbury, and then later in the 9th century, Archbishop of Canterbury. And you can see here St Dunstan kneeling at the foot of Christ, arguably the earliest self-portrait in British art. And here he is. But that book actually has come to rest, and here it is again. And I'd like to just draw to your attention that a name scribbled at the top of that page. You can just see Thomas Allen, D.D. Dono Dedit, Thomas Allen was one of the antiquaries of the 16th century who had access to books either in or that had recently been in monastic libraries. And he's responsible for saving this book, one of only 60 from the monastic library at Glastonbury, out of probably 1,500 or 2,000 to have survived the Reformation. And those other books were destroyed, like the Oxford books, sold for scrap. And then this figure comes into being, which brings both of these stories together. Sir Thomas Bodley, of course, raised in Exeter to a Protestant family. He spent the reign of Mary Tudor as an exile, together with Nicholas Hilliard, who actually painted this portrait. So they were both school friends, kind of childhood friends together. And then Bodley came back, married a rich widow, a pilchard merchant in Exeter, and then became a courtier in Elizabeth I's court, and then a diplomat traveling Europe. And he came back to Oxford effectively having retired, and found that library room having laid waste, and dedicated himself the rest of his life really to re-establishing it, to refounding the library. And that collection, you can see some of the original bookcases that he organized to be put up, and most of the books on those shelves are still the in their original locations as Bodley and his first librarian on the 25th, as Thomas James placed them on the shelves at the end of the 16th, early 17th century. And I think the success of Bodley's new venture in Oxford was because of its dedication to preservation, and the idea that this institution would look after books that were so threatened in recent times was part of what motivated Bodley, but what also motivated others to give him money to support his new project, or to give books because they would be looked after, as indeed they have been ever since. I fast forward in time again to the 19th century and to the events that took place under this gentleman's leadership, Sir George Cockburn, the leader of a British expeditionary force which attacked the former British colonies in North America, the United States, in the wars of 1812 to 1814. And Cockburn, in this magnificent mezzo tint, was responsible for the burning of Washington in 1814, the events that are depicted in the background to this portrait. And their focus for that target that took place in August 1814 was, of course, the center of government, the Congress of the United States, in the only stone building in Washington at the time. And here you can see it in a watercolor painted just after the fire. And you can see the smoke damage out of the windows. And of course, in one of those rooms was the Library of Congress, about 5,000 books, which had been established in 1800 by Congress as a kind of a working library for both the members of Congress, but also the officers who needed to either help develop the legislation or to enact it. Of course, it's a fabulous source of combustible material when the British troops, and we have a fabulous eyewitness account written by one of the members of the British Army, George Gleig, who reports that it was, he'd never seen a sight more sublime than the burning of Washington. But even he admitted that actually setting fire to the library was not was something which he said was to be regretted. But one of the troops took a book as a souvenir from the Congress building before it was set on fire. In fact, not from the library, but from the office, the room that the president occupied. And this was given as a souvenir to Admiral Cockburn, who then kept it in his family. It was subsequently sold and presented back to the Library of Congress in 1940. But if you go to the Library of Congress today, you'll see a fantastic exhibition about the Library of Thomas Jefferson. And again, there's this tremendous act of destruction. Virtually the entire library was lost in August 1814, but that prompted Thomas Jefferson, of course, one of the early presidents of America, one of the founding fathers of the Constitution, who had retired to his home in Monticello in Virginia and heard a few weeks after these events of the fire. And he wrote a letter to one of the Washington newspapers decrying it as a great act of barbarism and offering his own library to replace it, not as a gift, but at very kind of cheap rates, which Congress eventually agreed to. And so Jefferson's library acts as a moment of preservation and renewal for the Library of Congress. 1940 August is not a great month for the survival of knowledge, because a century later, this library, the Library of the Catholic University of Louvain, one of the four national libraries of Belgium, which was a relatively new country at the time, less than a century old, was targeted by German troops and set on fire and destroyed. A great library, a serious library for a very serious university, and but also a symbol of kind of, again, of national pride, a symbol of a nation's promise for the future place where its young people were educated. And again, it was regarded as an act of barbarism. Here's an article in an Irish newspaper in 1914, one of thousands of newspaper articles, again, relating it to the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, which we know is now a myth, but they didn't at the time. And if you use Google Books Ngram Viewer, I encourage you to kind of play around with it. It's a kind of word frequency tool, but you can see, if you just put the term Louvain, you can see the references to Louvain in printed literature have this enormous spike after 1914. And of course, the destruction again prompts an acts of preservation and renewal. And this time, libraries all over the world had campaigns to raise money or to find books to be sent to replace the burned library. There's actually a separate clause in the Treaty of Versailles in 1918 that charges the German people with replenishing the stock of the lost library. But the American people decide that they will take on the burden of replacing the building. And this becomes an opportunity. So Americans think for soft power in Europe. They'll rebuild this famous library after this outrageous act of barbarism. And here you can see the architect's drawings of Warren and Wentmore, the American architects who designed the new library. And you can see in the cartouche in the bottom left-hand corner, this legend, destroyed by the Germans, 1914, restored by America, 1922. But actually what happens is it takes them much, much longer to raise the money than they originally envisage. And what happens in the intervening period is that actually the Belgians kind of forgive the Germans for this terrible act. And they want to kind of bury the hatchet with their neighbors and just get on with, business and trade. But the Americans are very embarrassed and annoyed by this, because the architect designs the building with a great plaque, which has this same legend, destroyed by the Germans, restored by America, in Latin. And they put it up before the official opening ceremony in 1929. And what happens is that a Belgian citizen climbs up and smashes it. And this happens not once, but twice. And eventually the Americans decide to relocate this plaque to a war memorial outside of Louvain. And it becomes very embarrassing for them. They get very annoyed, and it's actually one of the triggers for American isolationism in their foreign policy, because it's seen as a kind of humiliation after they raise all this money. And here is the building today. Here's that same library building in Louvain, but actually it's rebuilt twice. Not just in the 1920s after the 1914 destruction, but the library gets targeted by the Germans again in 1940, and it's shelled and destroyed, and it has to be rebuilt again. But fortunately, it does get rebuilt, and you can go and visit it today. Moving forward in time, we go to, arguably the period in history with the most loss of knowledge, the Holocaust of World War II. And I'd like to take you to Vilna in Lithuania, the capital city, known at the time, known today as Vilnius, but known as Vilna at the time, a place of great religious and cultural life for Jews, and as the city of great religious significance for Judaism, the city of the Vilna Gaon, the famous rabbi. Here he is, but also a place of important libraries and archives, such as the Strashun Library, created by a wealthy Jewish merchant and book collector who leaves the library to the Jewish community in Vilna. And here is the Strashun Library's reading room and its librarian on the eve of World War II, Chaikel Lunsky. But there was another important institution in Vilna called YIVO, the Yiddish Institute, which tried to document ordinary Jewish life and culture, like music, like theater posters, medical records, poetry, all sorts of things from contemporary Jewish life, which the YIVO Institute sought to document in as rich a detail as it possibly could, but also including great treasures like this, the diary of Theodor Herzl, the great leader of the Zionist movement. But then, of course, in 1941, the Nazis turn east and invade Central and Eastern European countries in Operation Barbarossa. And in the wake of the stormtroopers comes this man, Johannes Pohl, who is a Nazi librarian. Actually, he'd worked in the State Library in Berlin, but he is in charge of a group of Nazis who come and target libraries and archives. And they target libraries and archives to be sent to Frankfurt to a kind of perverted research institute called the Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question, established by Alfred Rosenberg, the chief architect of anti-Semitism. And Pohl and his team move to Vilna because of its famous libraries and archives, and they establish a process of sorting the documents and books they find there, some to be sent back to Frankfurt to the Institute and others to be destroyed. And here's one example. Here's a Talmud scroll written on vellum, which is reused as, I'm sorry, I've got these slides out of order, reused as a canvas, in this case for a portrait of Arthur Seyss for one of the leading Austrian Nazis. I'm sorry, we're going to have to go in the other direction to this image. So here you can see the contents of the YIVO Institute's library being sorted through to be sent for preservation in Frankfurt or for destruction in the paper mills outside Vilna. And this task is undertaken by a group of librarians and scholars who are found in the Vilna ghetto, which had been established in 1941. And they have to go through this terrible task of sorting through the books for to be either alienated or stolen or destroyed. And what they decide to do is to smuggle books and documents back into the ghetto every night after their day sorting material. And they manage to do this. They're called the Paper Brigade by the German troops, but they call themselves that. But they risk their lives every single day to smuggle knowledge back for preservation where it's hidden in the ghetto. And they kind of know in their heart of hearts that they will not live to see the day, but they hope that someone will uncover their treasure of knowledge, their treasure of books. And indeed, that's what happens. The majority of the Jews in the ghetto are murdered by the Nazis when it's liquidated in 1943, but a few escape. And here you can see two of the members of the Paper Brigade who escape. They join the partisans in the forest, and with the Soviet troops, they push the Nazis out in 1944, and they recover hundreds of thousands of pages of books and documents that they had rescued, that the Paper Brigade had saved and preserved. An absolutely astonishing act. And one of the members of the Paper Brigade herself, this is Dina Abramovich, and Dina was the librarian of the ghetto library, but she then survives World War II and survives the Holocaust and becomes a librarian in New York. But this process of trying to save Jewish culture and the written word, the documentary evidence of their culture, takes place not just in Vilna, but in cities all over Central and Eastern Europe, such as Warsaw, where you can see the archive of the Warsaw Ghetto that's established by an extraordinary man called Erwin Ringelblum, is being uncovered from the wreckage of the Warsaw Ghetto after the war. But astonishingly, the institute called YIVO in Vilna has a survival itself, because its director, Max Weinrich, is actually out giving a lecture in Copenhagen when the Baltic states are partitioned by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939. And he moves to New York because he can't go back to Vilna, and he establishes YIVO in New York. And what you can see here are the crates of the YIVO documents that had been sent by the Paper Brigade to Frankfurt, to Rosenberg's Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question. And American troops in 1945 overran this collection, and they went through a process of trying to identify the rightful owners of those original books and documents. And they discover that YIVO is re-established in New York, and they send them what they can find. And here you can see them uncovering those collections. And here they are today in the YIVO Institute in the Lower East Side in Manhattan. Carefully guarded and looked after. Another August, another moment of destruction, and this time it's in 1992. Events which are not just in living memory; they're really events that did not take place very long ago at all. My brother served in the UN in Kosovo in the same period of time. But here in August 1992, you see the National Library of Bosnia and Herzegovina targeted by Serbian troops who are, of course, besieged Sarajevo, and they target it deliberately. No other buildings in the neighborhood are shelled. The library is shelled with incendiary devices. And not only that, but the firefighters and librarians who try to rescue collections from the burning building are targeted by Serb snipers, and indeed librarians lost their lives. And I went to look at the newspapers of the time, and shockingly, you don't see in the subsequent days the destruction of the National Library doesn't even make it to the front page. You have to go kind of deep inside the newspapers to find the story. And And it's not just the National Library that's destroyed. Many other libraries in Bosnia and Kosovo are destroyed by the Serbs. And it's another moment of cultural genocide going alongside and prefiguring a human genocide. Because, of course, last year we marked 25 years since the massacre of Srebrenica. And again, funnily enough, it's another Jewish book that symbolizes the perseverance of knowledge, the Sarajevo Haggadah, that becomes the symbol of Sarajevo's persistence and survival. I'd like to end with looking at the current kind of digital world we live in, where, of course, digital knowledge is subject to destruction just as physical knowledge is. And you can see that with where the big tech companies change their business models. You can see it with web archives like the Internet Archive being attacked. You also see it with neglect. So like the survey that took place in 2011 of the website of the Supreme Court of the United States, which discovered that no fewer than 40% of the web links were actually broken. And we know that through the activities of Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, that social knowledge in the form of these huge bodies of knowledge in the social media, that what my colleague at Oxford, Timothy Garton-Ash, calls the private superpowers, that they control so much knowledge. And of course, they don't keep an archive. It's not part of their business model. And so libraries around the world are beginning to try to find ways to archive these huge bodies of knowledge, like Facebook, where the National Library of New Zealand is inviting New Zealanders to donate their Facebook profiles. And of course, we all thought that that these companies were collecting this knowledge, like your search engine history, your likes and so on Twitter or Facebook, for targeted advertising. And I tried this out by searching for BMWs and then going onto the Guardian website, and lo and behold, all the adverts pop up trying to sell me BMWs. I drive a Volvo, by the way. But of course, we know that they're doing so much more with this knowledge than driving advertising. And again, going back to Assyria, you think of their focus on knowledge to help predict the future. Well, if you wear a Fitbit or an iWatch, all of your medical, your kind of health data that is being harvested by these devices is all about predicting your future health. And of course, Google just recently bought Fitbit, and they're now able to mash up your health, your kind of vital statistics that it's recording, your pulse rate and so on, with your search history. Have you been searching for the symptoms of heart disease? And who controls this knowledge is now of great social concern, I think. And of course, we must remember the fragility of many of these platforms. And I'm responsible for the national legal deposit responsibility for web archiving by chairing the Legal Deposit Implementation Group. And we know from the web archiving work that the UK Web Archive does that just how fragile the web is. And of course, social media is fragile too, as Donald Trump discovered. And there are kind of private initiatives, kind of activist archive initiatives like FactBase that were archiving his Twitter feed all along before he got ejected from Twitter. Which reminds us of Orwell's warning that the past is subject to if we don't look after the past, it will be rewritten. Which brings us to your own great institution, the National Library of Wales, which I've been a collaborator with since I worked in the National Library of Scotland, actually in the previous century. And of course, its recent campaign to protect its own funding, which I played a small part in supporting, shows us again this idea of neglect and fragility and decline if we're not careful and if we allow it to happen. And just to, at the end of my book, I give a series of reasons why we must value libraries and archives, and they're pretty obvious, really, to a group like the Aberystwyth Bibliographical Group. But just to remind you, they're important for education. Of course, that's perhaps the most obvious reason. I think they're important for bringing a diversity of knowledge. And I don't just mean a diversity of language, but a diversity of ideas, a place where you can encounter all sorts of ideas that you might not if you relied on your own collection or your own web browsing or your own ability to acquire knowledge yourself. A library can do so much more in bringing a diversity of ideas. And libraries are also places where citizens' rights are maintained. And that's why I found the Home Office's destruction of the Windrush Landing records so troubling. And they're also places where facts can be verified and truth can be preserved. And not just things like Magna Carta, but perhaps more mundane, but absolutely vital rights. And going back to Bosnia, the Serbs were anxious to destroy evidence of land holdings that Muslims had owned property in Bosnia, so they targeted provincial archives and land registries. And they're also important for identity. And I don't need to point out to a Welsh audience how important bodies like the National Library of Wales are for preserving cultural identity and celebrating cultural difference. And that really brings me to the end of my talk. And I thank you for listening. And suitably enough, here's the Earl of Pembroke wearing a mask and in the quadrangle of the Bodleian, and I invite you to ask any questions.
Okay, everyone can turn on their video and sound again. Thank you very much indeed, Richard, for that wonderful talk. And to use the title of a book by William Blades just over a century ago, he talked about the enemies of books. And it seems that humans themselves are frequently the enemies of books. You talk about barbarism, but also some very heartwarming stories about people risking their lives to preserve knowledge. So are humans the enemies?
Well, they're one of the enemies. I fear that, there are, through history, as I try to recount, and, I've been, some people have been very anxious to point out other instances of the deliberate destruction of libraries and archives that I didn't include in my book. And if it had just been a catalogue of every single one, I'd have had to fill, unfortunately, many volumes. So it's really just a series of case studies that are, indicative of the kinds of motivations that people have had to, erase the past, to destroy truth, to replace it in some cases with alternative facts, alternative truths, or to weaken a state or to weaken a community. And I think that, alongside those kind of, momentous events like, the Holocaust or Bosnia, we also need to remember that those acts of decline and neglect. you see it, that we're not yet 3 months into 2021, and I've been involved so far in trying to support the National Library of Wales to get its funding restored. I'm writing at the moment to the chairman of the Victoria and Albert Museum, who are proposing to cut the staff of the National Art Library from 30 to 8. We've also seen the Wallace Museum in the Wallace Collection in London attempt to close its library and archive, and a public campaign has made their trustees reverse that decision. So, and of course, across Britain over the last 10 years, we've lost almost 1,000 public libraries. We are living in terrible times, I fear, and we need to celebrate those individuals who have risked and sometimes lost their lives to preserve knowledge, and be inspired by them to do what we can for our own libraries and archives.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, please?
Yes.
Yeah.
If I may, I'd just like to say that because I come from an archival background and I'm a paleographer, I was particularly horrified by what was done with the records of the Windrush people, because why didn't the government and those who destroyed them realize that they legally, because they were created by government, they legally fall into the category of public records, and destroying them is a crime?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think the jury is still out on whether they, knew precisely what they were doing, or whether they didn't. That the standards of record keeping and the understanding of the role of the National Archives and the 1958 Public Records Act have diminished to such a poor state that it was an accident. So I think the jury is still out on that. I mean, there are worse cases. I talk about in my book the so-called FCO 141, the hidden archive of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of so-called displaced and migrated archives that had to be revealed as a result of the Lords of Appeal, the Supreme Court forcing the Foreign Office to admit to its keeping these records. In this case, it was to do with Kenya and the Mau Mau Rebellion. Yeah. And of course, these have now been transferred to the National Archives in proper and good order. But I'm afraid the state of record keeping in our government is extremely poor. But whether it's deliberate or just kind of incompetence depends on whether you believe in conspiracy or cock-up ideas of history, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? Anush, did I see you wave your hand at some point? No.
Yes. Can I ask a couple of questions, please?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, two completely different questions, if I may. The first question, Richard, and by the way, thanks very much for that fascinating talk. Really, really appreciate it, the detail and richness of it. If I may talk about examples of destruction of knowledge and books from the last century, you cited, of course, the arch book burners, the Nazis. You've talked about the scandal about Windrush era documents being destroyed. You've talked about a minion of Trump creating a kind of alternative universe of false knowledge. And of course, you talked about the Serbian atrocities. It strikes me that there's a connecting thread through all of those atrocities, and that is hatred of the other, hatred of the migrant. And also it strikes me that there are examples of right-wing atrocities. Are you implicitly suggesting that contempt for knowledge and a desire to suppress knowledge is an inherently right-wing phenomenon in the modern day?
No, I don't think I'm sorry if I sort of conveyed that. I hadn't meant to, because you know, there are numerous examples of communist, of left-wing destruction of knowledge. You know, the Soviets. You know, there are many examples of the Soviets. You know, I will. You know, the Chinese, the Chinese Communist Party in the, you know, Chairman Mao's activities through the Cultural Revolution, for example, you know, absolutely wholesale destruction of knowledge. So there are many, many examples on both sides of the political spectrum. I think it's about authoritarianism. It's about the imposition. It's about power. It's about the imposition of ideas without democratic processes being allowed to, you know, fall into play. And one of the arguments I place in my book is that actually we should be regarding the preservation of knowledge as one of the pillars of an open society, as one of the kind of supporting pieces of infrastructure for democracy, because it allows for, you know, an educated electorate, for one thing, but it also allows, through archives, you know, a transparency in the way that governments work, you know, elected officials operate, when it operates properly. And that, you know, this is one of the reasons why we should be protecting those institutions. But on the flip side, it's one of the reasons why those institutions are attempted to be suppressed. So I regard it as, you know, libraries and archives are the enemies of authoritarianism.
Thanks so much. My second question is much less politically contentious or problematic, and that is, I just wonder if you're being a little bit too hasty to condemn, shall we say, internet providers and social media outlets. And I'll tell you what your comments on that really reminded me of. There was a great Shakespeare scholar called Kenneth Rothwell, and Professor Rothwell was the first Shakespeare scholar to take an interest in the study of Shakespeare on film and Shakespeare on television. And he used to tell a great story about approaching the BBC circa 1980 and saying, I'm terribly interested in seeing tapes of Shakespeare productions from the 1940s and 1950s. And he said that this quite authoritative lady said to him, "Sir, it's a British Broadcasting Corporation. It's not the British Archive Corporation." So the BBC, of course, have caught on to the value of archives in the last couple of decades. And I just wonder if those great internet powers that you speak of will catch on sooner or later as well. So maybe we're just a bit too hasty to condemn them.
I'm less sanguine about that, actually. And I think I didn't really have time to go into detail about my argument, and I'm sorry if I kind of quite sort of skated over what is quite a kind of complex series of issues. My problem with it is that these big companies, the big tech companies, the private superpowers, are creating an archive, or they have power over an archive. They don't think of it as an archive, but it's one that we all create for free. And we should have access to that, not just to understand, you know, who posted what on Twitter, whether, you know, what were Donald Trump's tweets like, but actually to sample the data so that we can understand what society is like in the early 21st century, what was going on. And at the very least, that we should have access to the political adverts that Facebook were mashing up with data from Cambridge Analytica to target people in the 2016 Brexit referendum or the 2016 presidential elections. We know that they were using that data, you know, your online behavior on Facebook. Which posts were you clicking like to? Which posts were you sharing with your friends? They were using that data together with voter lists in order to target people either with voter suppression or to target people to be influenced by other political advertising. But we have no record of this. I think we ought to be able to understand what was going on in those cases. And so one of the ideas I have in my book, and I actually published it elsewhere before my book, but I repeat it there, is for a memory tax on the big tech companies, so that to fund libraries and archives in order to maintain digital archives at the appropriate level, which is very expensive. It's very important, and we should be funding libraries and archives to do that work properly. And I think we're better in these hardened economic times than to look to the people who are making these extraordinary, obscene profits, in my humble opinion.
Thank you so much.
Are there other questions? Rydian.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much for the talk, which I greatly enjoyed. You used the word fragility in the context of the web. I think that's a very valuable word, because people can be seduced by the convenience of the web and assume, well, this is the way forward. We don't need what went before it. And I think some people even believe, well, we can get rid of libraries because all knowledge will be on the web and easily available to us. And not remembering how fragile the whole structure is. And generally speaking, I think it's probably easier to get rid of websites than it is to get rid of libraries. The old-fashioned book has retained its value, and it's harder to get rid of than an awful lot of electronic material.
Well, I'm there are sort of I believe we need to preserve both. That's my view. We need to be preserving, the physical documents, the records of the past, and we should be digitizing them and sharing them. But we should not be throwing them away. We should be keeping them and preserving them properly. But we also need to preserve the born digital reflections of modern society. We should be preserving the web, we should be preserving email, we should be preserving electronic publications, precisely because they're so fragile, and we risk creating a challenge for society in the future, which will be unable to understand where it has come from if it doesn't have what I call these stepping stones from the past through to the future, which is what we have when we have a proper library or a proper archive. And that's what our society and our communities need.
Thank you.
Are there other questions?
Hello, David.
Marianne, yeah, sorry, we can't see you, Marianne, but...
Sorry, you can't because my well, anyway, I'm going to that. I just wanted to say it's not a question, because I suspect I'm the least academically, person here, academic. But having said that, it was a brilliant talk. Thank you very much, Richard. I just wanted to say, I'm sure I'm not the only one here who noticed that today's long read in The Guardian, I'm sure we're all good Guardian readers, is Syria's rebel librarians.
Oh.
And I picked it up at lunchtime. I stole it from my husband, who's a big Guardian reader. So I'm working from home. We all are, aren't we? And so with my sandwich, I read half of it. So I hadn't read it all. Haven't read it all yet. But one thing that struck me was your description of John Leland in going to Glastonbury. And you said he was stupefied. I think I've written that down. when he saw, and there's some relationship with that article. So you're probably all too busy to have read it yet, but
Yeah.
I'm going to finish it now.
Oh, well.
But I love a bit of serendipity, so that's my only comment. But thank you very much for a lovely talk.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. I shall go. Yeah, no, I haven't had a chance to
Exactly.
read The Guardian yet, but I will go and look it up after I have my dinner.
Yeah, I love a moment of serendipity, so I'm just mentioning it. So
Great,
thank you very much, Richard, and everyone. Nice to see you all.
Okay, Roger, was there a question or?
No. We were just moving. But thank you very much. Yes, it was an excellent talk. Thank you. It was most interesting.
I did have a thought, and it's not much to do with what we've been talking about, but I went to Argentina to study the works of Borges. Mercedes wouldn't be here if I hadn't been there. And one of the reasons for going was at the time Borges happened to be the national librarian. And I was very anxious to consult his early works because I managed to find only one of them in what was then the BM reading room. Unfortunately, two things happened. One was that the government had neglected to maintain the roof of the National Library. It's rather remiss. And the library was closed. But nonetheless, I was welcomed to the National Library by Borges. And I inquired about whether I could consult his early works. And I consulted the catalogue and they weren't there. And it was probably a case of a writer who happened to be national librarian trying to disown his earlier work.
Yes, he himself had removed them.
He himself had probably removed the books from the shelves.
My goodness. Great story. Thank you.
Okay. I remember when I was at library school in the late 60s, they used to talk about the national bibliography as being the nation's memory. And but in actual fact, it's libraries and archives that are the nation's memory, but increasingly it's the world's memory, isn't it?
Yes, correct.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard, for that wonderful talk, and which has prompted a lively discussion.